Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, most podcasts put their promotion and cup rattling stuff halfway through or towards the end. But because if everything goes well, you're going to be asleep long before we get there, I need to put this stuff up front. The show is brought to you with the help of many of the supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from people more and more often these days via email and social media how valuable they find the show. And those supporters who want to and have the means to help to fund the show, to keep it going and help me reach new audiences are very much appreciated. So if you would like to, and you have the means, a little bit like a cup of coffee a month or something you'd like to throw my way, please take a look at patron.sleepytimetales.net or take a look at the link in the show notes or from the website to go see what you can get as a supporter. There are real rewards available from as little as $2 a month, over and above the knowledge that you are helping thousands of fellow insomniacs to get a good night's sleep. If signing up for monthly support seems a little bit much, there are other options available as well. So other than the Patreon, there's the tip jar on the website, there's the merchandise store and others. The merchandise store has a new mug design which I'm quite fond of, and even masks. If you buy masks as well, another one gets donated to a useful cause as well. So you're getting something that I think the future is going to see us using quite a lot. You support Sleepy Time Tales and you support frontline workers as well. But other than digging in your pockets and handing out money, there is another huge way that you can help. I don't really do much in the way of advertising for this show. I focus on doing good work and doing the best thing I can for my listeners. And it's doing very well because you, the listener, is the person who helps me spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, simply let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, please make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. And I'll just give you a little bit of a shout out there. I'd also like to involve listeners a little bit more in the show. People in general like the stories that I cover and how I read them. But if there's something specific you would like me to read to you, please let me know. I've started doing some new, more well-known classics rather than the slightly random, strange things that I do. But if there's a story, short stories or novels or something you would like me to read into, or even the occasional bit of non-fiction, as long as it's published before 1923, pop me an email at contact@sleepytimetales.net and I'll take a look and maybe your request will go into the rotation. Last but definitely not least is all, I've got to give my shout out to the music, which as usual is Un Désert Bakumiku. The music is available on the Free Music Archive, and I've linked their website in the show notes as they've got some very cool stuff that they release under various names that I recommend checking out. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? It's a bit of a strange idea, isn't it? A podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with the anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. I'm someone who has struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. My parents had sleepless nights with me for many years, and even once I got old enough not to bother them, sleep really was always a struggle for me. It was only later in life when I discovered that when I was trying to listen to podcasts at night, because I was expecting to lie awake half the night, that I discovered the tendency for voices, particularly droning male ones, to act almost like a tranquilizer for me. I started listening to podcasts specifically for the purpose of helping me sleep, and I eventually discovered that there are some out there specifically designed for that. But when I recommended them to other people after finding that they worked really well for me, they often didn't really transfer. Like, other people didn't find them as useful or satisfying as I did. So I thought to myself, I'm someone with a boring, droning male voice. Maybe I can reach some others that other sleep podcasts can't. And so I started up Sleepy Time Tales. Now, every episode starts with this long introduction. It's here for a couple of reasons, and while it's the thing that I've mentioned before I get the most complaints about, it's not going to go anywhere because it does serve two very important purposes. For people who've just discovered the show and don't necessarily know what Sleepy Time Tales specifically or sleep podcasts in general are really for, I think it's important to explain the concept and explain the structure of the show to people, because it is a bit of an odd idea. So to get people on board with it, I think I need to spend a little bit of time to make a case for it. And for people who've been with the show for a while, I don't need to make the case for them anymore. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create new habits. Insomnia and sleeplessness are habits that we develop over time. We have an unhealthy relationship with the night time and our beds and sleep. And people who've had bad habits in life will tell you that one of the best ways to get rid of a bad habit is to replace it with a good one. So that's what we do here. For all the listeners, this is a chance to put the show on and let it run in the background and get ready to sleep to prepare themselves and their space. Because ultimately what we're trying to do here is trying to build a space together, some nest or cave, or little comfy little cabin that you can snuggle into. So for newer listeners, what is the point of the show? How do you make use of it? Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage. For me, when I listen to my sleep podcasts, I need something to listen to. I need a story or a series of events, which I suppose is what a story is. Something to keep my mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties. I need to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for me. For some people, it may be something a little bit more primal. Sometimes people just need background noise, whether it's the sound of the ocean or sound of a river or the wind in the trees, or maybe some boring dude just reading a story to you. Speaking of boring dudes reading stories, tonight's is a return to Ship of Coral by Vere Stacpoole. The first episode started off quite excitingly with a shipwreck. Two French sailors are shipwrecked and stuck on an island, which is not the worst place to be stuck in. They find a strange ship that's stuck in a pool in the middle of the island, covered in coral, and emotions get high and unfortunately turn to violence. Now, the one remaining sailor is dealing with the consequences of his actions and, spoiler alert, not doing a very good job of it. But whatever the story is, I try, even if it gets a little bit exciting, I try not to make it too exciting. The main thing is you can't force sleep when it comes for you. You just need to keep a light mental grip on the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you when it's ready, so that you don't resist. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important you don't feel pressurized. if this is your first night with the show, if you're a new listener, this probably won't work for you. I would suggest you give it 2, even 3 nights. I think 3 nights is a good try. And I would make the same recommendation with any sleep podcast or something similar that you listen to. You've got to get over, there is a natural resistance to this idea, to listen to some strange person droning at you in the dark. And I think it's natural to be a little bit suspicious of that, a little bit cautious of it, and not quite be able to just lean in. And so I think it takes a couple of nights to sort of develop a trust, to know that you can trust me, that you're in safe hands here, and get over the natural inertia and start developing a new habit of not resisting sleep anymore. What I also do with my sleep podcasts is I often find one isn't long enough, or that's actually not accurate. It used to be a case that one wasn't long enough. I used to have to queue up a few to fall asleep. But then I also find now that I wake up at 3 a.m. and I can't get back to sleep. Or sometimes I even wake up at like an hour before my alarm goes and I can't. And I used to sort of say, okay, well, that's my night's sleep over. But now I leave my sleep podcast running. I download a whole bunch and then I start on the latest episode usually and just let them play through the night. And then when I wake up at 3 a.m., if my earbuds are popped out, I just pop them back in and I find myself going straight back to sleep again. And you may say to me, Dave, why are you bothering to go back to sleep an hour before your alarm if you've woken up naturally? And I've got to tell you now that sometimes is the best hour, or sometimes even 30 minutes of my night. If I wake up 15 minutes before the alarm, I don't usually bother. But if it's 30 minutes or more, I pop those earbuds in and boom, there I go, straight back to sleep again. And I've even had people contact me and say, thank you so much for that recommendation, because they also find that is the best part of their night. But whether you're struggling to fall asleep at night, or you're waking up in the middle of the night, or right before your alarm, the very important thing is that you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. So please ask for your good and mine. Please just give it a bit of a chance. That's really the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark. And while you do that, I'll tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. And most importantly, I need you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is one of the great enemies of a good night's sleep, and the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up and inviting you to sleep into a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it's not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life and progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. This episode we return to The Ship of Coral by H. de Vere Stacpoole. Chapter 5 Amidst the Bushes. After the first outburst of raving, impetuous grief, the grief of a child rather than the grief of a man, Gaspard rose from where he had cast himself down by eaves. The sun had long passed from the sky, and the star-smitten sea came in smoothly, rhythmically, breaking in foam on the starlit sands. And there on the sand lay Eves, listening to what the sea was saying. His great right fist, clenched, was lying on his breast. One might have fancied that the meaning of it all and the mystery of that sky so filled with fire and passionate life, and those wastes of the ever-fretting sea, had been revealed to him in one stupendous moment, that he had struck himself on the breast in the stupefaction of wonder that he was gazing and listening, motionless before the revelation of forevermore. Eves, from a common man, had become at once and at a stroke a part of the immensity and the wonder of the night, the reachless stars and the fathomless sea, and for a moment, Gaspard, standing before the body of the man he had slain, saw death as the prehistoric man saw it, before language had robbed thought of its freshness and power. For a moment only, and then the stars became the stars again, and the sea, and the dead body of Eves the body of a man he had slain in anger. And now that his southern nature had spent itself in a wild outburst of grief, just as a child spent itself in an outburst of weeping, thought came back. Well then, whose fault was it? The knife was flung with no intent to kill. What right had he to die of a scratch like that? And the vile word, that was the last of a long series of injuries. And bit by bit his mind went back, counting up the score of these injuries, right back to the tobacco-smelling bar of the Riga and to Anisette as he had last seen her, with a little grimy hand resting on the great hairy paw of Eves. That remembrance, like a hideous lamp, lit up all of his grievances, enlarging them twofold. No, he was not to blame. He had not meant to kill, and if he had, look at the provocation. He stood for a moment, his chin resting in his hand, his eyes on the body before him. Then he turned and, walking down to the sea edge, dipped his hands and washed his face in the foam. As he turned up the beach again towards the trees, wiping his streaming face with the sleeve of his coat, he felt as though all the occurrences of the last few hours had happened years ago. So remote did they seem for the moment. The sight of the body lying there, so still in the starlight, brought him to a pause. Grief rushed back on him, driving all little and evil things from his mind. He stood looking at his handiwork. It had been an accident. He had not meant to kill. He did not even remember flinging the knife. The act had been automatic and committed in blind rage. All the same, he had killed Eves. Then, loathing the business which had to be done, he seized the body of his dead companion by the shoulders and began to drag it towards the bushes. As he stepped from the bushes, his task accomplished, he cast his eyes over the beach. It lay white in the starlight, and there was nothing now to tell of tragedy but the knife lying there just as it had fallen after its murderous work. He picked it up, dug it in the sand, and replaced it in its sheath. The belt with the pouch of money lay under the trees. He picked it up automatically and, carrying it in his hand, turned to the little tent. And as he walked towards the tent, two heavy hands seemed pressing down on his shoulders. Unutterable weariness had suddenly fallen upon him, robbing him of mind and almost of movement, so that when he reached the tent he was staggering like a drunken man. He crept under the shelter of the tent, and with the belt and the money beside him, he fell into a profound and deep, dreamless sleep. Chapter 6. Alone. When he awoke, it was full day, and the sands beyond the tent opening lay white and blazing in the sunlight down to the blue lazy sea. He remembered everything at once. It would almost have seemed that his mind behind the veil of sleep had been reasoning the matter out, for he had awakened, saying to himself out loud, and as if he were continuing a conversation, "Yes, and what is more, I saved his life." He crawled from the tent and stood erect beneath the palms. The morning, warm, sweet, and sunlit, lay around him, the sapphire sky and flashing sea, snow-white gulls and snow-white sands. A hot, gentle wind was stirring the palm fronds. He collected some dry brushwood for the fire, lit it, and piled on some wood from the wreck. When it was alight, flickering 100 red tongues at the sun and staining the blue air with smoke, Gaspard was brought to his first pause. Of what use was the fire? He was no good as a cook. Eves had been the cook. He had cooked crabs, tinned meat, and what not, using an old tin for a billy. He was born for that sort of work and could do anything practical he turned his hand to. Eves had always done the cooking while Gaspard had looked on. This fact struck Gaspard for the first time now. It was as though the dead Eves was still proclaiming his superiority. Eves had solved most of the stores. Eves had hunted for dead brushwood. Eves had found crabs. Eves had found the spring of water. Eves had found the boat sail. Eves had built the tent. Eves had found the ship of coral in the lagoon. Eves had found the gold. Eves had done everything since their landing, and he, Gaspard, had done nothing but smoke and dream. Far from being a waster, he had still left everything to the big blond man, so full of energy and resource and the joy of life. The southern laziness had held possession of him. All the same, Eves had proved himself the better man and was proving the fact now, voiceless and dead amidst the bushes as he was. Gaspard kicked the fire to pieces and flung sand on the embers. Then he breakfasted on some ship's biscuit and some tinned meat, lit his pipe, and strolled down to the sea edge. It was 8 o'clock, and the grasping warm wind came in over the morning sea, the lazy deep blue sea, so infinite, so beautiful, so desolate. He stood, and shading his eyes, he swept the horizon. Not a trace of sail or smoke could he see. The sky of a burning emerald, just above the sea line, swept up into the burning blue, and from the sea and sky, like the breath from a great blue mouth, came the warm wind. It felt like a woman's hot fingers playing with his hair, like a woman's warm arm cast around his neck. From the southeast, with the wind now loud, now lower, came the crying of the gulls. Though he had heard them since awakening, he had not noticed them till now. He turned his eyes to where they were wheeling and flying spirit-white in the blue. It was at this moment that loneliness seized his heart. The fact of his utter isolation had not stood before him full square till just now. The gulls were explaining it to him. "You're alone, 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 hi, 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 you there on the sands, alone, alone, alone. We have nothing to do with you, we are nothing to you, alone there on the sands, all day long and night and day and night and day. Who will you speak to? What will you do? You there on the sands, alone, alone, alone." He drew his sleeve across his brow to wipe away the sweat that had suddenly started tingling through his skin. Then he cast his eyes again over the sailless blue of the sea and, turning, came back to the tent. When he reached it, the terror left him, fell from him suddenly like a dropped cloak. He cursed himself for his stupidity, and though his pipe was not half exhausted, he tapped the tobacco out, refilled it, and lit it. It was something to do. Then, to drive the thought of Eves away, he fell to imagining what sort of a ship would take him off the island, and then he stretched his hand into the tent and pulled out the belt and pouch of money. On the brass buckle of the belt, all green with verdigris, there was something scratched. He cleaned the brass with sand. It was something to do, and made out what seemed the initials SS. He pondered on these for a while, and then, opening the pouch, he turned the contents onto the sand. Though he knew the number of coins, he counted them again and again. It was something to do. Then he began to spend them in fancy and the remembrance of the tragedy of yesterday, always standing like a ghost behind his thoughts and trying to obtrude itself. This occupation lasted him an hour, and he was brought back from it suddenly by a tug at his heart. It was still morning, the awful day had scarcely progressed, the mantle of loneliness had fallen on him again. The gulls were still crying, calling, wheeling, rising, falling, fishing mechanically and seeming part of a tireless mechanism, fretting the speechless blue of the sky. He put the coins back in the pouch and flung belt and pouch into the tent. Then he rose to his feet and made towards the bushes. On the sand still lay a mark as though a heavy sack had been dragged along it towards the bushes. He avoided the pointing of the sinister path and struck across to the islet, crushing the brushwood underfoot. He had no object other than to get away from the place where he was. To keep in motion, to be doing something. The heat lay heavy over the bay cedars. The air was shaking blanket fashion under the fiery rays of the sun. The bushes were dense, yet in a trice it seemed to him he had reached the southern beach. The islet seemed to have led him across it to explain its smallness, and as he stepped onto the beach, a new sensation caught him in its grip. The sensation of being ringed in, enclosed in a small circle from which there is no escape. Yet there were no bars, and around him on every hand stretched infinity. He came along the reef forming the edge of the lagoon. The tide was beginning to flood, and the foretop of the ship was standing stark and dry from the water. The ship herself was clearly to be seen, in this light even more clearly than in the sunset glow. But the picture was far less beautiful. Grey and dead she seemed, lying there in the diamond-clear emerald of the water. But the lagoon this morning was gay with fish. Parrotfish, gropers, flights of carolid arrows, sapphire, ruby, and emerald-tinted ghosts. The swell of the incoming tide came slobbering over the reef. Shutting one's eyes, one might have fancied a giant shuddering and catching his breath and sobbing to himself. Gaspard stood for a long time, watching the moving life of the lagoon, absorbed as a child might be before the contents of an aquarium. He had forgotten loneliness for a moment, but she had not forgotten him. As he stood with his eyes fixed on a large fish, sapphire and mist grey, that had developed like a spirit and was now hanging motionless with moving gills above the ship, casting a vague shadow upon the coral-crusted deck, he stood watching it. The breeze strengthened, stirring his hair, and on the breeze a voice hailed him, far away and weary. "Hi, hi, hi, you there on the reef. Hi, 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 you there alone, alone, alone. See how the wind takes us, wheeling, fishing, forever. Alone, alone, alone." He turned his face to where, across the islet, far away in the blue, the gulls' white wings were winking and beckoning to him. The voices, thinned by distance, had a desolation rendered even more desolate by the gorgeour of the burning blue sky, the triumphant sunlight, the licking of the warm, weak wind. There is no desolation so terrible as the desolation that lies in the summer warmth and blue skies. Here life ought to have been superabundant, but there was no life or moving thing save the wind and the gulls and the waves. "God," said the Moko. He thrust his clenched fist in his pocket, and turning from the lagoon he made his way along the rocks to the shore. He returned to the south of the islet, not through the bushes, but along the eastern sea edge, where the reefs were like rows of teeth and the rocks' edges like razors. Here it was that most of the wreckage of the Rhone had come ashore, and here there was still wreckage enough in all truth, here was something to do. In a moment, he was up to his knees in water. The Rhone, when the explosion of the boilers rent her asunder, had cast wreckage enough upon the water, but even still as she lay beneath the surface, sinking more and more completely to ruin, things were breaking loose from her and rising as bubbles rise from a submerged body, and drifting ashore with the tide. Hen coops, boxes, spars, barrels were pounding about in the surf. Heavy spars were here, all torn and frayed by the reefs. The coral teeth had left their marks on everything. There was nothing worth salving, yet Gaspard worked like a dock labourer, hauling upon spars, heaving at barrels, forgetting loneliness in the exertion of manual labour. But she was there, and a voice forever speaking, subtle like a music interpenetrating all things from the sound of the wave to the silence of the sky, made itself heard again. As the power of friction brings a machine to a pause, so did this voice, which was a part of the sunlight, a part of the silence, a part of the blueness of sea and sky, bringing Gaspard to a stand. He wiped his brow and looked at the heap of things he had collected. He remembered how Eves had laboured on the same job, and now, for the first time since the tragedy, as he stood looking at the heap of spars and wreckwood, a feeling of pity came to his heart for the man lying there dead amidst the bay cedar bushes. The outburst of grief to which he had given way on the evening before was, to speak truth, an outpouring of his more southern nature. Anger suddenly checked and flung back by death, inverting and bursting forth furiously at the sight of the irreparable result of his anger. But his feeling of pity for Eves came from the depths of his soul, for it was born of a pity for himself. It was fatal for this feeling to enter his heart just now, for the heart softening towards the dead opened the door for superstition to enter. He thought of the tent over there, beneath the palms, and how pleasant it would be if, on his return, he were to find Eve sitting by the tent. Then, with a chill of horror, came the idea, how awful it would be if, on his return, he were to find Eve sitting by the tent. His imaginative mind played with this idea for a moment and then cast it hurriedly away. He laughed out loud to reassure himself, and the steady wash of the sea made answer, and the distant gulls. Then, leaving the selvage bleaching in the burning sunlight, he came towards the southern beach. No, there was nobody by the tent, but the wind was playing with a loose corner of the sailcloth, flapping it about. The tent seemed beckoning to him as he came towards it across the white blazing sands. Everything, every sound, every gesture of animate or inanimate nature was beginning to have a deep and extraordinary significance for Gaspard. The silence, the sunlight, and the blueness had first conspired to show him his loneliness. The gulls had insisted on it, gloated over it, explained it. But now, since over there by the wreckwood, the pity for Eves and his fate had entered into his heart, the gulls, the silence, the sunlight, and the blueness were speaking a language less assured. "Are you alone? Hi, you there on the sands, what's that beckoning to you? Hi, hi." The wind flaps the tent, ha ha, hi. And then silence for a moment, and then weak, weary, querulous from the circling white spirits away there in the smoky blue of midday. Eves, Eves, Eves. The very poetry of loneliness, distance, blueness, regret. Fatal regret. Gaspard fastened up the flap, and the wind, as if vexed at being robbed of its plaything, shook the palm fronds, and then some of the finest of the sand on the beach gathered itself up into a little sand devil, and danced away on the wind. An unseen hand seemed moving everywhere fitfully, now here, now there, touching the sand, touching the trees, touching the bay cedar bushes. Gaspard, as he lay with his head in the shade of the tent, resting after his exertion, listened to the faint patter of the palm fronds and the whisper of the sand. Sometimes the sailcloth of the tent would lift a bit to the wind. It was only the wind, yet it moved like a living thing. Sometimes he imagined a hand lifting the tent cloth back and a voice saying, "Hello, what are you doing here?" He imagined Eves as the possessor of the voice, and he drove the imagination from his mind. Never for a moment did he feel fear of the body lying the way there amidst the bushes. Not for the worth of the roan would he have gone to the bushes to look at it and see how it was faring at the hands of corruption. Yet he felt no fear of it. On the contrary, it was a thing he dwelt on when he wished to allay fear. For fear, faint and indefinable, was taking hold upon him now. He had no compunction about the part he had played in the death of Eves. The thing was an accident, so he told himself. All the same, men who die suddenly and violently have a habit of haunting the place where they die. You can run from a haunted house, but you cannot run from the haunted island. This dread of no escape was what formed the true basis of his fear, a thing on which to build terrible and fantastic edifices. He lit a pipe, and smoking it, he fell asleep, awakening in an hour or so, refreshed and fearless. Sleep seemed to have wiped away loneliness, superstition, and all their attendant evils. He felt hungry, and getting some tinned meat and biscuit from the store of provisions which lay close to the trees, he dined after a fashion and then lit a pipe. It was now 3:30. The gulls had ceased crying, and afternoon lay on the island like a hot, heavy hand. So still seemed everything that one might have fancied the islet wrapped in idyllic peace. But it was the peace that broods over fermentation. The air over the sands was shaking in waves, and a faint hum of insect life came from the bushes. A torrid and tremendous pyramid of light stood upon nature, crushing her to silence, yet unable to stifle her faint fret and murmur. At 4 o'clock, Gaspard was standing at the end of the little pier of coral reef, just at the place where he had been standing yesterday, when Eve's voice had called him to see the treasure. There was no fish visible in the water today. Nothing floated there but an occasional scrap of seaweed. The clear water, bright as a diamond and green as an emerald, held the gaze with the fascination that lies in a globe of crystal. Out here at the end of the projecting spur of reef, with the sea on either side, one felt as though one were standing on the deck of a boat. It was pleasant out here, with the sea coming in gently around the rocks, leaving scarcely a trace of foam, scarcely a trace of sound. The islet was singing in the little waves, but the reef only gurgled, slobbered slightly when a higher ridge of swell lapped the more exposed portions, and sighed as the water sinking exposed the weeds, the clinging shells, and the coralline growths. Gaspard, standing, looking into the green depths, mesmerized by their crystal clearness and thinking of nothing, was suddenly brought to consciousness by the feeling that someone was standing close behind him. He wheeled round. Nothing. The reef, the islet, sea and sky were destitute of life, yet distinctly he had felt as though someone was standing behind him, almost in touch with him, almost breathing upon his neck, and he felt that if he had turned more sharply he would have caught sight of the viewless one. And the reef, the islet, sea and sky had for a moment a simpering look, as though they had succeeded in the trick of snatching the unseen one away before he could be glimpsed. The absurdity of this idea destroyed it almost as soon as it was born. He shook the sensation off with a little shiver, casting his eyes over the sea line again, as if in search for a ship. He began to walk along the reef back to the shore. He was stepping from the reef onto the sand, and when upon the sand he saw something that brought his breathing to a stop. The imprint of a naked foot. It was a footmark left by Eves, and there was nothing supernatural about it at all. It had been left on the previous day, and it was still sharp and clear, for a ledge of the reef had protected it from the wind and the blowing sand. But to Gaspard it was more terrible than the naked face of death. He walked away from the terrible thing, with his hand clutching at his heart, his eyes cast from side to side, not daring to look back. He did not know where he was going, but his feet led him to the palm clump. There he sat down with his feet to a tree bole. The terror was behind him, and the tree seemed to fend it off. The tree was a living thing. All at once it had stepped out of the semi-inanimate world where trees dwell and flowers and had become a living personality. In his supreme terror, he could have turned and embraced it, but he was afraid for a moment to move from his position. Just as a man is afraid to move who, attacked by enemies, has his back to a wall. Such terror does not last in its entirety for more than a brief space of time. Reason came to his assistance. He remembered that Eves had been by the reef end on the day before. The footmark was a real thing. No ghost could have left it. He was telling himself this when, hi, hi, hi. Loud, shrill, heart-snatching, came a hail right from behind him. It was the voice of Eves, and springing to his feet with a scream, Gaspard, clinging to the tree bole, looked. A great black man-o'-war bird with bright eyes and a coral-red beak was passing over the islet, inhaling it as it passed. Tremendous, definite, and strong against the blue, yet more soundless in flight than an arrow, it passed overhead without a motion of the wings. As it passed, it hailed the island once again, and once again from a speck out at sea, motionless but fast dwindling till it became a faint speck and was lost in the blue to southward. Gaspard, breathing freely again, watched the great bird losing itself in nothingness, lifting veil after veil of sky and horizon after horizon of sea. Bound for some port of call in the windwards or beyond. The shock had been better than medicine to him, showing him his own superstition and the stupidity of his alarm. The island seemed suddenly freed from the haunting presence. He began to doubt himself. If a bird could make a fool of him like that, he must be a fool indeed. A year seemed to have passed since sunrise, and the sun was now dropping to the sea, dropping to its end that vast blue day, so filled with loneliness and the terrors of the unknown. Chapter 7. The Boat. Most of us have never known the day as it is and the night as it is. Protected from the wind and by the sunlight, by walls and houses, by artificial light from the darkness, by words from the truth. We have created an artificial world in the midst of the true world. In the wind, in the sunlight, in the sea, there are voices speaking a language long forgotten. Lost when thought, becoming vocals, set up a language of its own, and a Tower of Babel in the world of dreams. Even still, when alone in the solitudes, on the moors, on the mountains, by the sea, through all the claptrap of language and thought come the voices. The true eternal voices that were before we were, and will be when we are not. Voices of which all art in marble, in tone, or in words is but the pathetic imitation, an echo dulled and muffled and debased. In this lies the eternal despair of art. To the mind of the commonest man, if he be imaginative, the language of the eternal things is far louder than to the mind of the most cultivated man, if he be only imitative. Gaspard's mind was of the imaginative order. Up to this, in the forecastle or stokehold, on board ship or on shore, he had been held apart by his fellows or protected by the common things from the eternal truths. Loneliness in her extremest form had brought him in touch with them, or at least within whispering distance. The great blue day, dying now, had searched his heart and mind. It was as though the old gods of nature had landed on the island and stood around him, viewless and perplexing him with whispers. Fear, air, distance, light, and sea had spoken to him, and in turn and in chorus. Loneliness had echoed what they said. There was something more in the wind and the sun, and the sky and the sea than he had known of up to this. The drinking bar, the forecastle, the sailor's lodging house, those black holes had hidden him from this knowledge. a debased language in which the word sea stood for wharves and ships, stokeholds and furnaces. Decks and glimpses of ocean had paralyzed his thought and numbed it. 12 hours of loneliness and fear face to face with nature had loosened the old false labels from the truths of things, and without a glimpse of the real truths, a dim recognition of the falsities unsettled his mind. The damning mesmerism of language had suspended itself partly for a moment in the partly unsophisticated mind, and he sat watching the sun sink in the western sea. The word sunset or the word sea never occurred to him. He was thinking without language, lost in contemplation like an animal viewing from a distance a new and curious but undisturbing phenomenon. And the sight was tremendous as 10 million cubic leagues of golden air could make it. Fire, light, and distance were there at this marriage of sun and ocean. Color, size, limit, all were banished from the infinite, indefinite universe of gold through which the golden sun was sinking to the golden sea. The sun had almost reached the sea line, and for a moment ocean and sun hung apart. The splendor of the sea answered the splendor of the sky. For a moment time seemed to cease, and silence supreme, everlasting, golden and beautiful, held the west in her keeping. A moment, and then, flashing and palpitating, leaping like a woman under a burning kiss, the great sea flung her arms up to her lover. Destroying him utterly and almost in a moment, washing him away, melting him as though he had been fire, had become wax, and the wax had been cast into a cauldron of boiling gold. Then, as if millions of infinitely tenuous golden veils were being stripped away with the rapidity of thought, bluer and bluer, darker and darker, appeared the night behind them. A hand seemed sprinkling and spraying the sky with stars. One could scarcely say, "It is night," before the night had taken possession of the world and the night wind was blowing in the palms. Gaspard, rising, stretched himself and then crept under the shelter of the tent. The opiate of the sea air and his weariness brought sleep at once, profound, dreamless sleep which lasted till just before dawn. He was awakened by a sound. Someone close to the tent had, so it seemed to him, struck a single blow on the drum. He raised himself on his arm, sleep had fallen from him like a cloak, and his mind was alert again and alive to fear. He listened, but heard nothing except the weary, washing sound of the waves on the beach. Then, as he listened, it came again, but from a distance. Boom. A monstrous sound in that desolate place, alarming and uncanny as the sound of a trumpet. If it were a drum note, then, judging by the sounds, the drum must be of gargantuan size. With the sweat running from his face, he crept out from under the tent and stood beneath the trees. Nothing. The new moon had risen and was floating like a little silver boat amidst the stars. The starlight flooded the sea and brimmed over onto the foam, so solid was the sky with stars that the palm fronds cut their silhouettes on it sharply and distinctly. Never was there a more lovely southern night. As he stood and listened again, from very far away this time, came the sound. Boom. As though the drummer had stridden away leagues across the sea to beat his drum around the world before dawn. Had Gaspard known these waters, the sound would have had less terror for him. It was the sound of great devilfish, sea bats that rise from the water, quiver for a moment in the air, and then fall, smashing the waves to foam with a noise that reverberates for miles. But he knew nothing of the sea bats, and he stood pursuing in his mind the drummer who had beaten the strange reveal, and with his eyes fixed on the horizon to the eastward where the sky was stained by the dawn. It came, killing the stars, clear and cold in tint, beneath the sky shifting in color from smoke gray to aquamarine and icy blue. Then it bloomed into warmth and kindness of tone. Just as children hold buttercups to one another's faces to see the yellow reflection, so one might suppose some hand beneath the horizon, was holding a vast buttercup to the dawn's pallid face. A thread of living gold stole along the sea line, became a fiery moving caterpillar, and at a stroke, the last stars were washed away, dissolving in blueness and infinite distance. The sun was peeping across the water, and then suddenly, as though he had taken a leap elbow high and elbow resting on the sea line, he leaned forward and struck the world in the face with his great golden hand. Had you been watching Gaspard as he stood with the dawn wind blowing his hair, you would have seen the stroke of the sun's hand on his face, on the palms behind him, on the sea before him, suddenly given as a blow. The same hand was striking the Bahamas, and in 100 blue harbors from Cape Sable to Port of Spain's ships' topmasts were catching the light. Martinique, Guadeloupe, Grenada, peak, morn, and valley were already flaming to it like green torches in the dawn wind. Key West would be stricken in a moment, and the Gulf to Galveston and Tampico be turned from a lake of stars to a living sapphire. The Caribbean would leap alive from Grand Cayman to Darien, from San Juan to La Guaira, alive and burning in blue. The wind that was blowing in Gaspard's face, a wind that came over the blue and laughter of the morning sea like a wind from the golden age in the youth of the world, held freshness for the orange groves and the gardens of all these western islands where the night jessamines were closing, the night insects ceasing their songs, and the fireflies preparing to put out their lamps. Gaspard knew nothing of that tremendous poem in colour which the dawn shows to God each time she lifts the darkness from the tropics. Just now he did not see even the sunrise in its splendour. He had for a moment forgotten even his fears. His eyes were fixed on an object about a mile away to the southeast, something round and black that bobbed in the sparkle and glitter of the water. It was like the head of a swimmer, and now it was like a drifting buoy. It was drawing nearer, the current was setting it towards the island, and now it was like a boat. It was a boat? There could be no mistake. It underwent alterations of shape as it twisted to the slap of the waves, now head-on for the island, now nearly broadside on. A boat. Released from the islet in its dreams and terrors, the cry that escaped from Gaspard seemed echoed by the gulls. He made for the pier of coral reef, running along the sand to it, forgetful of everything, never glancing at the place where the footsteps of Eves had been, scrambling over the coral till he reached the extreme end, where, surrounded by the morning sea and the wind and the light, he shaded his eyes and watched. The boat was now plainly in view, dancing on the waves with the lightness of a walnut shell on the ripple of a pond. It was empty and drifting towards the islet, but it would not touch the beach. It would pass by a few hundred yards. He saw that, and he prepared for the event by casting off his clothes. It seemed a small boat, midway between a dinghy and a ship's quarter-boat, and never to Gaspard's eyes had anything appeared so gay in motion or so friendly as this tiny craft dancing upon the waves. At a distance it had seemed black, but now he saw that it was painted white. It was clinker-built. So clear was the air he could see the overlapping planks, and now, as he stood preparing to take to the water and swim to it, the terror of the islet, which he had shaken off for a moment, came back behind him again, and once again held him back and urged him forward. What if the terror followed him into the sea? Behind him there seemed a deadly enemy filled with wrath at his attempt to escape, and for a moment the want of power that comes to us in nightmare held him shivering in the wind. The next he was in the sea, striking out for the boat. He had to swim against the current that was carrying it. The waves hit him in the face like wet hands trying to drive him back, but the shock of the plunge had given him his courage. The boat was close now, beautiful and buoyant and white as a gull. Smacking the sea as she came, shining with spray, the green water under her showing clear as an emerald. Now she was only an arm's length away, and now, as he was grasping the starboard thwart, she heeled over slightly as he got in his elbow on the thwart and peeped in. She was empty of everything, but at the bottom boards and a pair of sculls, clean scoured with spray. A dead flying fish was lying washing about in the few inches of water she had shipped. It was nearly dead and had struck her only perhaps an hour ago. He worked his way around to the stern, boarded her, and stood upright. He was free of the island at last, but he would have to land to get his clothes and some provisions and water. And that's it for tonight. Thank you for joining me. A reminder that if you like the sound of this story and would like to read it on your own, you can find it on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Desire by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.